I'm actually very interested in your take on the role of science in the kind of psychedelic renaissance, because again, perhaps surprisingly, as a scientist, I would kind of rather advocate for um, these things being available as rather widely as soon as possible, because I think there are indigenous traditions that know how to kind of handle these substances, and I think the science is good. I mean, it's always good, but it's kind of good for maybe to from a PR perspective, so people are less worried about the potential risks with these things. But yeah, what's your take of the role of science in when this gets
Well,
rolled out?
it's interesting. When I wrote How to Change Your Mind, the subject was still a lot less acceptable to mainstream people and publications, and I relied heavily on the science for that reason. I mean, if you wanted to make something credible in our society, you need to have some peer-reviewed science behind it. It's just kind of it's a given. And I didn't talk that much about the underground, and I talked very little about indigenous use. In this new book that I have coming out this summer, I delve into the whole indigenous use with mescaline, or the mescaline producing cacti. And you're right. I mean, mescaline goes back 6,000 years of being used, presumably in a religious context. So we have long experience as a species, and it's being used in the Native American church as a powerful healing agent. I think that's a fascinating case because it gives us a very constructive and conservative model of drug use. I mean, it's something that we think of drug use as tied to social disruption, hedonism, dulling of pain, self-medication, all the moral categories we put drugs in. But here you have something that psychedelics don't fit into that in many ways. First, it's often hard work. It's not escapist as much as people might think it is. But in this Native American community, it's about group healing. It's about healing, the wounds of colonialism and dispossession, healing alcoholism, family disruption, all this kind of stuff. And it happens in a group, very carefully choreographed ceremony. And it's been remarkably effective on the testimony of, a great many Native Americans. So it kind of forces you to rethink, what is a drug? And maybe we shouldn't put all these substances under that rubric. Maybe that rubric is just meaningless at this point. So anyway, so I've gotten much more interested in the indigenous side. Had I filled How to Change Your Mind with shamans and curanderas, you would never have heard of the book. Well, maybe you would have, but many other people would not. So anyway, I was trying to correct that balance a little bit with this new piece.
Yeah, I'm really excited to read that, because I think yeah, we have this, obviously, these things being used as medicines is a wonderful, wonderful thing. But there's this risk that, when you look at the history of mescaline containing cacti and their use in America, they were kind of clamped down on so aggressively, and it was so irrational and so kind of purely based in domination, the way, Native American people were treated around that there could be an easy way where people just go, let's not reckon with that. Let's just say we've got this new medicine, we're going to put it through the usual process by which a medicine gets rolled out, and we don't have to think about that. But I mean, the wonderful thing with psychedelics is they kind of, not for everyone, but they generally encourage you to look at these kind of grander narratives and the interconnections of things. And I think it's a healthier thing to confront the past traumas that have been inflicted there and say, well, actually, this is something that should be promoted and we should reckon with, rather than just kind of run into medicalization.
Yeah, and I think even the people doing clinical research are acutely aware of that. This whole field rests on the back of indigenous wisdom, and the guides are certainly aware of that. You see remnants of indigenous ceremony in the way that drugs are administered. Some people are kind of embarrassed at that, but a lot of people are very respectful about it, and that and there's active conversations in how do you have some reciprocity about that, or reparations about that. I'm involved with a psychedelics center that's just formed on the Berkeley campus. And, we have conversations about how are we going to, make that recognition explicit? How are we going to make sure that we're including indigenous peoples in what we're doing? And there are companies too. There's a company called Journey Collab that wants to work with mescaline, in fact, to treat alcoholism, which is a reasonable hypothesis because it's done that for Native Americans. But the Native Americans figured that out. And so they're trying to figure out a way to flow a significant part of their profits or revenues to Native American groups. And we'll see how that all works out. But it's definitely part of the DNA of even the industry. And that's as it should be.
Yeah. Actually, I'm really interested in this center at Berkeley that you mentioned. I'm quite jealous because a few years ago, I was actually a visiting researcher in that same department at Berkeley.
Oh, really?
I wish you guys had been down the corridor at the time. But
well,
yeah, so what are you up
back.
to there? Yeah, I'd love to.
Yeah. So it's the Berkeley Center for the Science of Psychedelics, and it's kind of a slightly different beast than the other psychedelic centers. We're not doing clinical research. Berkeley, as you know, doesn't have a medical school. That all happens at UCSF across the bay. But we have a really good neuroscience department and a really good psychology department and a pretty good journalism department that I'm attached to. And so we're looking at other things that need to be done as we move into what I see as the next chapter of the psychedelic renaissance. And that is legitimizing these substances in science and in the public. Producing and we want to do basic science around psychedelics, look at issues like predictive coding and how psychedelic, either low dose or high dose psychedelic experience could help us understand that better. So Michael Silver is a neuroscience who studies visual perception. We want to do some imaging too, and we have some very powerful tools for imaging that we'll be using. We want to do training too. One of the bottlenecks in the field is going to be lack of trained guides to administer the drugs, whether in a research context or once the drugs are legalized. And we want to figure out ways to optimize training. Should guides be trained in a different way if you're treating addiction than cancer, or there's a lot of, we haven't validated a lot of what we're doing scientifically around training. And then the third thing is doing some public education. There's a huge amount of curiosity out there and not a lot of good journalism in the field so far. So we'll probably do a podcast, a newsletter, a website with a lot of resources, hold events and dialogues, convene people to discuss things like Proposition 109 in Oregon and how that's going to unfold, or some of these issues of indigenous wisdom in the field. I'll be in charge of that part of it. So altogether, I mean, the where we're moving is, hoping to bring psychedelics into mainstream use and clear up misconceptions about them and keep people informed. While doing hopefully some important basic science. Our scientists have never worked with psychedelics. What's interesting about it is that these are people who establish themselves as very good scientists who want to work with psychedelics, and that we're going to be able to give the opportunity. And we also have cognitive psychologists too, so that perspective too hasn't been brought to bear in the research. So yeah, it's very exciting. We're in the process of raising money, and we've got enough to get started. But we have big ambitions, so.